Hi students, we are going to discuss today about the food composition databases, their uses and how they are going to be understood, and we have to learn from the food composition databases basically to learn the relationship between the diet and health. Food composition databases are generated worldwide. India is no exception. India too has generated food composition databases for various nutrients for all the food groups which we commonly consumed in this country. Food composition databases are sets of data for the various food groups which will be generated using the modern methods of analysis and both the nutrients and non-nutrients. In addition to, phytochemicals are also being generated. Food composition databases in India particularly comes from the National Institute of Nutrition, Indian Council of Medical Research, Hyderabad. This is a book which should be useful not only the students of the food science, nutrition, dietetics and the registered dietitians and the policy makers, industry and for the various stakeholders. So, to understand the food composition database, one should look into the locally consumed foods and their nutrient values and how they are going to be useful to assess the diet quality. These are the issues which we are going to learn, and ultimately after this module you will able to understand the relation between the diet and health, and also you will able to understand how to read and understand the food composition database. Now, we will know what is food composition database. Food composition data are detailed sets of information on the nutritionally important components of foods and provide values for energy and nutrients including protein, carbohydrates, fat, vitamins and minerals. For other important food components such as fiber. Earlier people used to talk about the crude fiber, now it is obsolete. Now the modern concept of the fiber is dietary fiber. The data are presented in food composition databases. This is all about the food composition database. So, we are thinking that food composition databases have a limited use. No, they have a vast uses and many stakeholders in the society. So, we learn one by one what are all the various uses of the food composition database. Epidemiological studies. Nutritional epidemiology provides a means for identifying relationships between dietary factors and health in human populations consuming usual amounts of foods and nutrients. So, we generate constantly the epidemiological data using the food composition database. Another aspect is development of dietary guidelines and consumer education. Reliable and comprehensive food composition databases that are representative of available foods are an essential tool for the development of food-based dietary guidelines. Food composition data are also important for the provision of dietary guidelines and advice on healthy eating for the general population. You might have heard about recommended dietary allowances for Indians. This is primarily based on food-based dietary guidelines. For this also we need the food composition database. We must know about the various food groups, what are their quantities of consumption, what are the nutrients which it has, and what are the indigenous foods or local foods, or the people who are consuming less familiar foods also will be trapped in the food composition database. That will be useful for generating the food based dietary guidelines. So, food regulations and food safety. Do we always talk about food security? Food security is very important, and nutritional security should be the integral part of the food security. And when we talk about the food for the human health, the first and the foremost thing is about the food safety. When it comes to the food safety, the regulation comes into the mind. So, how this food composition database will be useful in the food regulations and the food safety? Many public health nutrition decisions depend on the availability of adequate data on the food and nutrient intake of populations, and in a country like India, where nutrient deficiencies such as iron and vitamin A are major public health issue, accurate food composition database is necessary to take a conscious call for combating micronutrient deficiencies in the country. You might have heard about the iron deficiency anemia is much prevalent in this country. So, the fundamental thing one should look into when people have generated the data on iron deficiency anemia prevalence in this country, then immediately the next concern will be advocacy, how to advocate the rich foods of iron. So, where we have to look at that data? It is the food composition database, where you will find the iron values for the various food groups, where you can easily categorize the iron rich foods from there, and you can easily advocate such foods for the community. Labeling is another important aspect where the food composition data will be useful. In India, food labeling is now mandatory under the PFA laws, which have started with the proximate composition. You understand what is proximate composition. It gives about the protein, fat and the carbohydrate, and with this you can easily calculate the energy value, and the water content sometimes will be given in the proximate composition. Food manufacturers and industry will now be able to utilize the huge nutrient database in the food composition databases, which is current and includes all nutrients to meet the PFA requirements of the country. Diet counseling, very important area where the food composition database will be useful. Dietary assessment is carried out in the clinical practice by using the food composition database, usually by a dietitian or a nutritionist. In order to assess a patient's nutritional status or nutritional risk, this assessment is then used as a basis for providing dietary advice or nutritional support. So, when people usually go to the clinics for some sort of medical checkup, they will be advised to go to dietitian or a nutritionist, where the nutritionist or a dietitian will assess your nutrient intakes and they will give a sort of a report to the doctor for further advice on the dietary aspects. So, food composition database, that way it will be a useful tool for nutritionists and dietitians, like a ready reckoner for diet counseling and for the dietary advice. Consumer information and marketing is another area where the food composition database will be useful. For example, within the catering industry, food composition data is used for menu planning and recipe analysis to provide meals that meet certain nutritional criteria. Therefore, people use this database in the food industry also for consumer information and marketing, where they will use that food composition database to critically to enable the food producers to meet the consumer needs. The food composition data will be useful. Another important area where the food composition database will be useful is in planning of institutional diets. Large group of populations are provided with food in this way. For example, in midday meal program or other social welfare measures being implemented by the government. The food composition database can also be used in hospitals, prisons, military establishments, schools and daycare centers. These are the various places and various nutritional intervention programs which are currently under operation by the state governments and the central government, where the food composition database can be effectively utilized. Sports nutrition and expeditions is another area where the food composition database will be useful. Food composition data are also used in the sports and fitness industry to help plan diets for athletes and sports professionals. For example, now India is also facing the triple burden, not only the micronutrient deficiency but also the overnutrition, that is people are with overweight and obesity is increasing. Therefore, people are going for physical activity to the gyms and to the various places to maintain their body fitness as well as the weight management. There also you require a diet counseling. For that, for planning a diet, you require a food composition database where this will be effectively utilized by this industry and also in the sports nutrition, where national or international athletes can be prepared to face the challenges by planning proper diet plan using the food composition database. So, once these are the examples which I have mentioned for utility of the food composition database, but there are other sectors also where it can be used effectively. So, now once you have understood the depth of food composition databases uses across the various sectors of our society, now as a student of food science, nutrition and dietetics, or as a nutritionist or a dietitian, you must know what are all the food components which a nutritionist should know. There has been a growing interest in the range of dietary phytochemicals, particularly in view of their possible protection against cardiovascular disease and certain cancers. For example, carotenoids, polyphenols, sterols, etc. It is necessary to obtain such information for diet planning. Such information is not available in many food composition databases, but like USDA database, UK database and German databases are updating with these bioactive phytochemicals content for commonly consumed foods. Dietitians should also be aware of the data on contaminants like mycotoxins, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, etc. in common foods for their negative impact on human health. Some constituents have undesirable physiological effects, for example, goitrogens, hemagglutinins, trypsin inhibitors, oxalic acid and phytic acid. Other important natural toxicants include solanine, cyanides, laterogens and nitrosamines. So, when you are looking at the food composition databases, suppose you could not find some of the nutrients. So, for such non-availability of information on food components, where to find? Users with specific needs have two options. One, they can generate the data themselves, gathering representative samples of the foods of interest and assaying them for the derived components. Or they can estimate or impute the missing values from known data on similar foods and components. The first option requires resource that users rarely have, while the second requires clear and well-defined rules for estimation which do not currently exist. Thus, if data are missing for certain foods, either imputed values must be used or intake from that food will be taken as 0. Either way, there is a potential error. In the latter instance, the error will always be biased towards underestimation of total intakes. In the former, the error could be in either direction across foods. If the food is a major contributor of total nutrient intake, then error term becomes quite important. If the food is expected to be a minor contributor to total intake and if reasonable imputations can be made, imputation of missing data may be quite reasonable. So, how to read? Now, we will see how you can utilize the food composition databases. For that, we will know first what are all the world databases are available. As I have mentioned, worldwide people are generating the data food composition databases. I am just giving you an example of USDA database, UK database, German database, France database, Malawi database, Russian database, Spain database. So, like that you have, and you have the publication and how many food groups they have utilized, how many levels of food groups they have informed, how many food items they have incorporated in the food databases, and whether it is available online or the published data, or also have such information is available, so that users can also look into not only the Indian food composition database, for all other databases also. So, if you look at the Indian food composition database, its history, 1937 Dr. Aykroyd, second director of National Institute of Nutrition, who actually first published on the nutritive value of Indian foods with 218 foods and 13 nutrients. Later, the third director of National Institute of Nutrition, Dr. Patwardhan, in 1951, he updated the database with flesh foods and nutrients, particularly nicotinic acid and riboflavin, these water soluble vitamins were also added. Later, a major revision was occurred under the stewardship of Dr. Gopalan, the fourth director of the National Institute of Nutrition, published in 1971 with more than 500 foods with 18 nutrients. Trace elements were also reported in this revised edition of the nutritive value of Indian foods. Later in 1989, further it was updated by the fifth director of NIN, Dr. B.S. Narasimha Rao, by including iron, beta-carotene, dietary fiber and fatty acid composition also. So, the nutritive value of Indian foods is the current book which is available in the National Institute of Nutrition, which has 14 food groups were mentioned, like cereal grains products, pulses legumes, leafy vegetables, roots and tubers, vegetables, condiments and spices, fruits, fish and other seafoods, meat and poultry, milk and milk products, fats and edible oil, alcoholic beverages. Like this, total 14 food groups were mentioned in the nutritive value of Indian foods, with more than 590 food samples were included. So, what are all the various nutrients are available, like proximate composition, moisture, protein, fat, minerals, crude fiber, carbohydrate, energy, and the vitamins both water soluble and fat soluble, and minerals like calcium, iron, magnesium, sodium, potassium, copper, manganese, zinc, chromium, sulfur, chlorine, and various amino acids and various fatty acids, both essential and non-essential fatty acids, and the non-nutrients like oxalic acid, phytic acid, and also much important component which has been recently generated on the total dietary fiber, both insoluble dietary fiber and the soluble dietary fiber. How to use the existing food composition databases in the present day? As a student, how you will read this book? For example, if you could read the various nations' data, and if you compile that and if you put the values, for example, I am here mentioning about the egg of hen, where the moisture, energy, protein, fat, carbohydrate, calcium, iron values were given for various countries like India, US, Sweden, Japan, Malaysia, Africa, Australia, UK. But if you look at the values, appears to be different, but when you really compare the protein values, there is a variation. If you want to compare, we have to express the data on dry weight basis. This is how you should learn how to read the food composition database. You have the moisture or the water values are there. First, make the data, convert the data, you compare. If there is a real difference, you will see the difference. Otherwise, you don't find the difference. Like this, I have also mentioned a calculation how you can calculate the energy. For example, to calculate the energy value, you must have protein and carbohydrate. For 1 gram it gives you 4 kilocalories of energy, whereas fat gives you 9 kilocalories of energy. By calculating the per 100 grams, each component of protein, fat and carbohydrate, adding together total, then you can mention it as energy in kilocalories. Energy can be mentioned both in kilocalories as well as in kilojoules. I am giving you an example how to read or calculate vitamin A from a food by looking at the food composition database. For example, if you want to calculate the vitamin A activity from the egg hen, what are all the things which you have to look into in the database? You have to look at the preformed vitamin A. Here, for example, is 420 micrograms per 100 grams, whereas beta carotene was mentioned as 97, alpha and gamma carotene were mentioned as traces only. So, therefore, now you have to consider beta carotene being a precursor of vitamin A, which should be divided with the 8 value, so that you get the vitamin A equivalents. Pull the value with the preformed vitamin A, then you will have the total vitamin A activity for the egg. This way you have to calculate and report the vitamin A from the egg. Therefore, to calculate the vitamin A further, in other foods, which I have given you an example of vitamin A from the egg, where you have both preformed vitamin A as well as the precursor vitamin A. For example, if you take a food sample like tomato, where you have in tomato you do not find the preformed vitamin A, whereas you find precursors of vitamin A like beta carotene and traces of gamma carotene are also present in the tomato. And also you have abundantly present another carotenoid, that is lycopene, but lycopene is not a precursor of vitamin A. You should not take into the calculations of vitamin A activity. Here how you have to do? Take the beta carotene value from the tomato, divide that with 8, and if there is some traces of gamma carotene is also present, if at all, if the value is available, then you divide that with 16 so that you get the total vitamin A activity for the tomato. So, therefore, another example I can mention here is you can do with papaya, another fruit I am giving you an example, where you can utilize the vitamin A calculations by looking at the carotenoids, particularly vitamin A precursors. Here in the beta carotene, beta cryptoxanthin is another vitamin A precursor which is also present in the in the papaya fruit. Therefore, here also you have to take the papaya beta carotene value, divide that with 8, add to that of beta cryptoxanthin value by dividing with 16 factor, so that you will get the total vitamin A activity. So, like this, any other food also can be calculated, can be read. This data will be useful when you are really applying at the dietary survey. When you go to the community at a household level, or when you are advising individual person, when you want to assess the dietary intakes of various nutrients, you must have the food composition database, where you can also apply these calculations and you can assess the dietary intakes of various nutrients of persons and the family, ultimately the community, so that it will be useful for you to plan for a balanced diet by looking at the food composition database, and then you can really advise people what are all the foods to be included, and dietary diversification is the mantra. So, when you are advising people, you should utilize, because food composition databases are vast, very comprehensive. There were more than 14 food groups were mentioned. When you feel that when your balanced diet chart should be able to fulfill from all the food groups you should mention, so that there will be not only the nutrient, but also many of the phytochemicals will be in the diet. So, therefore, there will be an effective way of advising people is of dietary diversification and the balanced diet by utilizing the food composition databases. In conclusion, food composition databases are the sets of information of the various food groups with various nutrients, non-nutrients, anti-nutrients and also phytochemicals, which has been comprehensively collected and put in the one place as sets of information. These food composition databases are very useful for the food science and nutrition students and the practitioners of the nutrition and the policy makers, and the various uses of the food composition databases, like this can be used in the epidemiological research, regulations, labeling, food industry, catering services, and in the midday meal programs and various places where the food composition databases can be utilized effectively. Food composition databases basically gives information, the relationship between the diet and the health. So, this module has actually, we have discussed about how to use the food composition databases, and if the values are, if they are missed, from where we should impute, or whether how we can generate, how we should read these food composition databases by using modern methods of analysis, and we have discussed about how to calculate vitamin A, how to calculate energy, how to calculate the energy by including the soluble dietary fiber fractions also. Therefore, by utilizing the food composition databases, nutritionists and the dietitians can effectively plan a dietary plan, and food composition databases will give the information how to use the dietary diversification and the diet plan and the balanced diet for individuals as well as for the community.